Hey guys, here we are for chapter 8.2, the importance of marine aquatic systems. We're going to look at saltwater ecosystems, if you will. These provide a major economic and economic services for the human population. So it gets down to why is it important? It becomes very obvious. And they also provide a lot of irreplaceable reservoirs of biodiversity. Place some of these organisms without these freshwater ecosystems can't exist. Let's go ahead and dive right in. Some of these ecosystem services, what do they do for you and me and the rest of the planet? Well, right off the bat, oceans produce about half of the oxygen that we breathe. A lot of stats get thrown out where our oxygen comes from. Sometimes I've heard the term that the rainforest are the lungs of the earth. Oh, they're important, but they're providing mainly the oxygen that they need where they are. So many animals are breathing that oxygen that's produced by the trees. Not that it's not part of the whole thing. I've heard the taiga, those big northern coniferous forests provide, and it's all true. They all provide a lot of oxygen, but the ocean covers 71% of the surface of the earth. And all that phytoplankton, those producers are taking in sunlight, giving off oxygen. So all of these phytoplankton across the entire ocean are responsible for a large chunk and as much as maybe 50% of the oxygen that's produced on the planet. Pretty big deal. Most of the rain that we get from the water supply, just the water cycle, most of that water is coming from the ocean, coming out of the ocean. It's evaporating from a lake, it's evaporating from a river, it's evaporating from a puddle, but most of it's coming from the ocean. Seafood, all that lovely seafood, salmon, mahi-mahi, king mackerels, you name it, shrimp, clam, I can go on and on and on. Seafood coming from the ocean, obviously, and then the rain. Once again, the water cycle, but the rain that's falling over the land is largely picked up by moisture from the ocean. Once again, some of it is coming out of the lakes and streams and rivers, but the vast majority, once again, 97% of all water on the earth is salt water. That's where it's coming from. Now, our Earth's oceans are actually poorly understood. It's said we know more about the surface of the moon than we know about our own oceans. And part of that is, they're deep and hard to get into and explore, etc., but they're actually poorly understood. There's a lot of potential sources of both ecological and economic benefit. We just really don't even fully know or understand completely yet. So there's still a wealth of information out there about it. I'm going to throw the little picture up here of the natural capital that we find in our marine ecosystems. So we can look at some of the ecosystem services it provides and then some of the economics. So ecosystem services, these are the things that we really need to survive. So it provides oxygen like we talked about. Water purification goes on as things do go into the ocean. The phytoplankton and other animals and plants can purify what does get dumped into the ocean. It's a matter of how much. Climate moderation. The ocean holds a lot of heat, so areas close to the ocean tend to be more temperate. They bring warmth with it and they keep it from being as hot because the ocean breezes. There is CO2 absorption. A lot of the CO2 that is produced can get absorbed by the ocean. Well, look, once again, it's a matter of how much is too much. There are nutrient recycling going on, just like in every ecosystem. The water cycle, the carbon cycle, the phosphate cycle, etc. Oceans are a key part of it. They reduce a lot of storm damage. Mangrove swamps, barrier islands, the coral reefs, all these things help absorb energy from the waves, protecting the mainlands. And then also just a lot of the biodiversity species and habitats. The more biodiverse an area, the healthier it is, which is always a good thing. And then some of the economic services, things that we benefit from, can profit from, or we get food from it. We get energy from the waves and the tides that we make use of. A lot of pharmaceuticals come from the ocean. Our harbors, where boats come in as we sail and move goods here and there, the natural harbors that are created. Just recreation and tourism. We love to go to the beach, play in the beach, stay there in the sun, and then as employment. Because it's a recreation area, a tourist area, it provides a lot of jobs and employment for beach-related activities. And then minerals. A lot of the minerals we get, most of the salt that we get in some shape, form, or fashion came from the ocean. We may be getting it out of a salt mine now, but it was still pretty much ocean salt. And then when the earth pushed up, now it's in a cave somewhere. But not just salt, but a lot of minerals we can't actually tap in from the ocean. So they provide a lot of ecosystem services and economic services that are very beneficial for the entire planet, but especially humans, you and me. Now, we're going to talk about 3 major life zones, and later, when we get into the open ocean, I'm going to talk about 3 layer zones. So make sure you keep these separate. Life zones, very, very simple. Coastal area, near the coastline. Open sea, that means you're in a boat or whatever and you can't see land. Open sea, it's a very specific term. And the ocean bottom. So these are the 3 major life zones. Close to the coast, out in the open ocean, but we're talking more towards the surface. And then we talk about the actual ocean bottom. Major life zones that we see. Now, when we're talking about closer into the coastline, we can also talk about a couple of other areas. We can talk about estuaries. Now, estuaries are very specific. This is where a river system meets the ocean. So it's an aquatic zone, but it's both freshwater and saltwater. And where they meet, we call this an estuary. Estuaries are rife with life because you have the freshwater stuff coming in, you have the saltwater stuff coming in. It's a basic dump of food to the saltwater organisms, and some organisms get stunned when they hit the saltwater, don't like it as much. Anyway, it's just all kinds of life occurs in these estuaries, so a really important part. And then we can talk about coastal wetlands. Now here in Florida, like when I head towards the ocean or head out anywhere else, I go across the Jacksonville area and you can see those coastal wetlands, these salt marshes. Now let me just take a second here and talk about the difference in a marsh and a swamp. A lot of times you will hear those terms sort of intermixed, but there's a specific difference between them. Marshes are all green, weedy, grassy type plants. So if you look around and everything you see is like green stemmed grasses, things of this nature, lily pads even. Now in the coastal we're not going to have lily pads, but if it's all green stuff, it's a marsh. If you look around and what you see are a lot of woody stemmed plants, think trees or bushes, then it's a swamp. So you go and you can find a coastal marsh. Coastal marsh is all this grasses. It looks almost sometimes like a river going through because it's partially underwater. Now a lot of it can just be all salt water where it flows up and sits in. A swamp, and the most classic swamps at the coastal areas are mangrove swamps. So mangroves, but note they have woody stems. They're trees in effect. So if there's a lot of trees in it, it's a swamp. No trees and it's all low-lying and grass and type things, it's a marsh. So in our coastal wetlands, we have the estuaries, freshwater meets the sea. Then we have areas that are coastal wetlands, and we either have coastal marshes, we have mangrove swamps or mangrove forests. And then when we get into the ocean, we also talk about some of these wetland areas being the coral reefs and the seagrass beds. We'll have this grass growing up. And as you can see in these seagrass bed area, they support a lot of different types of life. Sea bass, other things. When I've gone hunting for scallops, fishing for scallops, scalloping, they're always in these grass bed areas. You look around and that's where you tend to find them. A lot of these are some of these coastal wetlands, areas where it is wet at least most of the time. Now in the case of coral reefs and the seagrass, it's always wet, but they're in very shallow areas. So, then we're going to talk about rocky and sandy shores. The ocean tide. About every 6 hours, most of our ocean areas, they go through a tide change from high tide to low tide. As the moon is orbiting the earth and as the earth is rotating, the oceans stay with the moon. The moon pulls our oceans a few feet towards the moon at any given time, so our oceans bulge towards the moon. So if you're out at the basic beach, because the moon is orbiting the earth and the earth is rotating as well, it's about every 6 hours that we go through a tide change. Now these tide changes pull up various interesting features. So you get this intertidal zone. If you've ever gone to the beach, you know the difference in high tide, low tide. The water's up really. Then way down you get a big beach, you get a short beach. Well, things live and have to deal with this area of shore between the high and the low. They have to deal with an awful lot. They have to deal with the water coming up and it's much cooler, or being left high and dry, if you will, and dealing with much hotter temperatures. Sometimes little tide pools get created in these areas and things can live and thrive there. But animals had to adapt to this ever-changing. Also, salinity levels. Because when it rains real heavy and the water washes down the beach into the ocean, well, the salinity level goes down. So they have changing salinity levels all the time. And things in this intertidal zone, this area around all the coastline, not real wide, not real big, but they have to deal with this intertidal zone. And we usually look and talk about these in areas where it's sandy, but it can also be rocky. Now, rocky shores are pounded by waves constantly. So anything living there has to be able to kind of hang on, deal with the constant waves hitting. Because it's not this slow, easy up the sand and back. It's rocky. The waves are constantly crashing hard up against it. But the rocks give places, little nooks, little crannies, hard surfaces to hang on to. As you know, the sand washes up and away, but the rocks tend to stay strong. We actually tend to find more life in the rocky zone areas than the sandy. It's not that there isn't life in the sandy zones, they're just different. So with the picture, trying to show some of the different ones. So a lot of times we find a little more life in the rocky areas, but once again, it's just different. Because there are plenty of other animals digging and burrowing down in the sand, and you have birds and other things coming up trying to feed on them, small fish trying to come up and grab these little crustaceans and zoom back in, and the larger fish waiting for them right back in the waves. But the rocky crevices have a whole lot more various things, but they tend to be clingers, sometimes crawlers, but a lot of times like clams, oysters, things that can actually glue themselves, if you will, onto the rocks and hang on. But they still have to do with this rising and falling of the tide. So maybe underwater part of the time, out of the water part of the time. It's an interesting aspect of life, finding a way. Barrier beaches and barrier islands. Now, a barrier beach is what we normally think about. This is just a basic sandy beach, like we have here. All the little organisms up and dealing with the waves coming up and coming back. There's a barrier beach. It's just a classic beach, but it is a barrier for all the ocean waves coming in. And classically, we have the beach, and then there are sand dunes. And the sand dunes are held in check by all the plant life, the sea oats and the roots help the sand dunes build up, and this provides a barrier for the rest of the continent behind it. And a lot of times our developers come in, we'll kind of talk about it next section, and basically get rid of the sand dunes and put in buildings. And this can cause all kinds of problems. Barrier beaches, just a nice long beach, classically with sand dunes, and this helps protect the inland areas from the ravages of the sea. And we have barrier islands. So a barrier island in America, kind of our classic one, is the Outer Banks off of North Carolina. But we have barrier islands down here in Florida, some smaller ones here and there in Pine Key, where you have this little island and then here you have inland. Well, the barrier island protects what's just in from it. These classically are long, narrow, just sandy isles. They're parallel to the coastline, because that's why they're the barrier. They protect part of it. And they really help keep the inland area protected from erosion, because all the ocean waves hit the barrier island and it's calm on the other inland side. So we have both barrier beaches and barrier islands to help mitigate some of the damage from the sea. Now we have a case study on coral reefs that we talked about before. And since we're here dealing with the saltwater ecosystems, we're just going to revisit it real quick. Now, coral reefs are like the marine equivalent of the rainforest. It is the most diverse ecosystem in the sea. All kinds of life there, from plankton, phytoplankton, zooplankton, krill, small things feeding on that, the coral itself, the polyps there, creating all kinds of crevices. Some things come there specifically to spawn and then leave. Other things spend their entire lives there. But they really are at risk, and worldwide right now they're being damaged, and in some cases just completely outright destroyed. Probably the biggest problem is our ocean acidification. Climate change is a big deal because they're very sensitive to temperature. You need to have clear water and in a specific temperature. Too warm or too cold can cause a problem. And they have to be at a certain depth. If the water gets too deep, not enough light gets down. So they're very sensitive ecosystems. But currently, it's the acidification. Carbon dioxide, CO2, dissolves in the water, H2O. CO2 and H2O will bond together in a chemical reaction forming H2CO3. CO2, H2O combining together for H2CO3, carbonic acid. And this decreases the level of carbonate ions that coral needs to form its coral. Most animals that secrete shells need it to make their shells. High rates of carbonic acid weaken the coral reefs and animals making shells. There's always been carbonic acid, it's just the levels are getting much higher, causing problems. We want to move on from this coastal area. Now the coastal area is only about 10% of the ocean, if you will, but about 90% of the life that we're aware of is in these coastal areas because it's shallow, it's warm, highly oxygenated. I have oxygen, temperature, sunlight, and nutrients. This is where we find most of our life. But when I move into the open sea is just that. You look around and you see nothing but sea. It's a specific term. It doesn't mean we're a mile out, 2 mile. We are completely away from land. Think 10, 15 miles out from land. You're in a boat, you can't see anything. This is open ocean. Then we're going to break it down into 3 layers. We'll put the picture up here to kind of look at these quick zones, and then I'll break down some of the things that are in them. So we have the euphotic zone. This is the light-reaching zone, if you will. Here we find a lot of phytoplankton. The nutrient levels, however, the other things that things need to feed on, is typically quite low. The dissolved oxygen levels are very high, and the only exception to this are where we have upwellings. There are areas in the ocean, a lot of times near a continental coast, where the winds blow and the deep water upwells. Now the water down deep is high in nutrients because everything that dies filters down, right? So a lot of the nutrients are down deep. When that deep water upwells, it brings nutrients. Then I have sunlight, oxygen, and nutrients, so we get a lot of life. But typically what we have are sunlight, temperature, and oxygen, but it's fairly low in nutrients. Then the next layer down is the bathyal zone. Now, between the euphotic zone, which is fairly narrow, but if you notice the grid, the meters begin to, it's not the same, it's not like 10, 20, 30 meters. I think it does it by like hundreds, but then it jumps to bigger numbers. So sort of pay attention, because the bottom layers are actually should be much larger. But so the first couple of 100 meters down, the temperature stays fairly warm worldwide, but up in the 20s, mid-20s or so. If you're accustomed to Fahrenheit, you know, we're talking high 70s, if you will. But then at the bathyal zone, the water temperature begins to drop quickly. It goes from the 20s down to the 10s, or down to about 4 degrees when we get to the very bottom zone. So this bathyal zone, we also refer to a lot of times as a thermocline. This is where that temperature decreases rapidly. Here, it's dimly lit. It's this middle zone, if you will. What we tend to find there are zooplankton and smaller fishes that kind of drop down here to sort of hide, if you will. Then at night, they move up and they feed in that euphotic zone. So the euphotic zone has most of our phytoplankton and other things that are living there, and some of these small fish and zooplankton, animal-like, but very, very small. And sometimes these are just like larval stage or the very early stages of some fish. And they come up and they feed in the euphotic zone at night. And that takes us down to the abyssal zone, the abyss. Here, no light penetrates, dark, cold, about 4 degrees Celsius, just above freezing. So we're talking, once again, if you're accustomed to Fahrenheit, we're talking in the the high 30s, very low 40s, very cold, dark. High level of nutrients though, because everything that dies up there, including the phytoplankton, the zooplankton, it drifts down into this deep area. So it's very nutrient rich at this level. There's very little dissolved oxygen, so anything surviving down here has to live on low levels of oxygen. What we tend to find are deposit feeders, things that are feeding on the stuff that has died and decayed, and filter feeders, things right down on the very bottom, clams, oysters, sponges, something that attaches to the bottom, and they literally just bring this nutrient-rich water through their body, gather the nutrients, and push out the remainders. The 3 vertical zones separate from the 3 life zones. So we have the area right near the shore, and this is trying to show where one of those upwellings are. Now out in the open sea, you're in the boat, you can't see land. It actually has very low NPP, with the exception of these upwelling areas. And that's what this picture is trying to show. So a boat is going out there to fish because it's a known upwelling area. And because it's a known upwelling area, the seagulls are out there trying to feed on things. There's lots of fish, lots of life there. So a lot of times as the wind blows, it kind of brings up this nutrient-rich area from the deep sea, and I kind of get this life zone where we normally don't find a lot. If you're out in the true open ocean, per square kilometer, you don't find a lot of living things. Of course, the aspect is it's very, very big. In the scope of things, its MPP is low per square kilometer, but there's so many square kilometers of it, there actually winds up being a lot of life in the open sea. Now, we are still learning about the ocean. Scientists took a census of microbes. It was thought that there wasn't really a lot of microbial life or various types out throughout the open sea. Well, a team of scientists, they took 2 years to go out and sail around the world, and every 350 kilometers they would stop, they would get a sampling, they would strain out the microbial life, and then they use supercomputers to run the genomes and test for the proteins that they find, which what we find in DNA, RNA, etc. And they were looking at the different protein combinations and chains, etc. And at the end of the 2 years, they were still discovering new genes and new proteins at about the same rate as when they started, letting them know that there's a much higher diversity of microbial life than we had previously thought, and a lot of it is probably still left undiscovered, since they were finding it at virtually the same rate at the end of 2 years as they were at the beginning. There is a lot we still don't know about the oceans, so there's a lot left out there to discover. Marine biology is a great field to go into. We have the 3 life zones. We have the coastal, the open sea, and the ocean bottom. We have the 3 zones of depth, and we're talking about in the open ocean. Keep those straight where we find the most life. And join me next time when we look at the effects of human activities on marine ecosystems. Take care.